So I had a request recently over Patreon to make a video on the topic of the transcendent function. What's quite interesting is not a lot of people know about this concept. And there's something of a paradox here, of course, because MBTI, even though it's based upon the words of Carl Jung, decided not to incorporate the topic of the transcendent function into its typological framework. And in many ways this makes a lot of sense because MBTI is predicated upon the basis of there being 16 distinct personality types. But there's a certain level of irony here because Carl Jung never really intended there to be 16 personality types. He never set out to create a personality classification system. All he did was make note of certain natural predispositions different individuals seem to have. Because Carl Jung's primary agenda was on the individuation process, and in many ways this directly contradicts the notion of there being fixed, static personality types. Because you see, the thing is, we are likely born into our respective cognitive type. But over time, the more that we dwell within this particular cognitive predisposition, the more we essentially cement our cognitive habits, the more we become addicted to a certain manner of perception and judgment. And the concept of the transcendent function refers nothing more to the individuation process as applied to cognitive type, the overcoming of our cognitive addictions, the potential for us to overcome our type entirely, the unification of opposites. Because optimally speaking, there is only one cognitive function. This is the transcendent function that Jung was referring to. The only reason that we subdivide our cognitive functions into 4 or 8 or 16 or even 32 is because of the way in which we are directly inhibited by our own cognitive predispositions, by our own cognitive type, personality type, if you will. Because at the end of the day, the best type is no type. The best function is all of the functions, because all of the functions rely upon each other in order to optimally overcome any given situation. But you see, much like the individuation process itself, the overcoming of opposites, the unification of the conscious and the unconscious, the transcendent function is not a fixed, static end goal. It's not even something which is necessarily achievable in that sense. Rather, it refers nothing more to the ongoing process of overcoming our cognitive type, overcoming the psychosis and various addictions that make up the human condition, acquiring an ever-increasing amount of freedom within the psyche, becoming increasingly less subservient to the oftentimes unconscious hang-ups and trauma that drive our significantly less rational behavior. The parts of our mind which are fragmented, scattered, antagonistic to the rest of our conscious agenda. And yes, the concept of control and choice technically doesn't exist, but there's a far cry between the constructive mind and the self-destructive one. And all people, to some extent, have an element of self-destructive behavior, are driven by fears and demons and scars, addictions and biases that are in every way antagonistic to the fulfillment of self, to the accruement of happiness, to our ability to affect the world in a positive manner. And the transcendent function makes up the part of the individuation process which refers to our cognitive functions, the overcoming of our cognitive addictions, an adaptability to the ever-changing world around us, our ability to one moment relate the self to the world, and the next minute relate the world to the self, our ability to one moment be deeply in touch with our own drives and our identity and what is personally meaningful to us, and the next moment to completely and utterly detach from the self in order to observe reality in the most objective manner possible. Our ability to hone into a specific external detail, hone into the task at hand, and subsequently zoom out, survey the landscape to encompass as wide a portion of reality as is humanly possible. This is a transcendent function, the function that allows cognitive type to become a malleable and fluid concept, what is in essence the overcoming of cognitive maladaptability. And as many of you already know, CPT brings the transcendent function back into the concept of cognitive type. It returns the emphasis of personality back to the individuation process. Because humans typically exist in boxes, exist in prisons that we make for ourselves. Because this gives us all a sense of security, confining our life, our reality, our cognition to a specific cell within a specific complex, creates the comfortable delusion of there being less information to work with, creates the delusion of simplicity. And living in such a cell, it doesn't mean you're going to be unhappy, it doesn't mean you're going to be unproductive, unsuccessful, but this does not change the fact that your cognition, your perception and interaction with reality is confined to a very small space. And of course, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is very much debatable, especially in the grand scheme of oneself as a component of the human race. But the individuation process, the transcendent function in this instance, it gives you the option to expand your scope of reality, to expand your scope of cognition, should you want to. And as for myself, I'll admit, I'm not very far along on this journey. I've got a lot more ground to cover. But again, that's kind of the point. It is a journey, it is an ongoing process. And while of course there will be dips in the journey, a certain kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back analogy, over time one is making progress. Over time, one's scope of reality and ability to interact with it in an optimal fashion is increasing. And alongside it, your ability to enhance the world around you. And going back to myself, I could make a lot of excuses. I could say that the projects I'm currently engaged in require a kind of hyper-convergent, introverted intuition, introverted thinking. Require a similarly divergent employment of that hyper-observational, extroverted sensing, extroverted feeling. Much of what I am doing at the moment is almost tailor-made for an INFJ natural archetypal predisposition. But the fact is I need to spend less than 50% of the day in that state. And any prolonged duration of this state beyond that 50% mark is not so much by necessity as it is by addiction. And more times than not, my addiction to my dominant functions have prevented me from maximizing my individual experience. And this is why I don't just offer consultations and type service, I also offer type development. Because in many, many instances, at least a level of type development, at least a level of the transcendent function can significantly enhance our lives. And honestly, I cannot say for certain if the world would be better off if every single individual under the sun was maximizing their potential for type development. But I can say every individual would benefit from it to some extent. But there is a substantial amount of people for whom extensive type development, a full individuation process, a thorough expansion of reality, if you like, would correlate directly with an increase in happiness and one's ability to affect the world around oneself in a positive manner. So I actually really enjoyed exploring that topic, and thank you again to my patron, Alex, for that request. So as usual, I hope the video was informative, and definitely share it with anyone who you think might benefit from it. If you haven't already done so, be sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it, that way you can stay notified of future content. Just a reminder, I do offer consultations, type service and type development, and if you haven't already done so, I definitely recommend you check out the CPT ebook as well. CPT is now on Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the channel in theory on that additional level, that would be massively appreciated. But just know that I am already massively grateful for your support over here. So thank you again for watching the video, especially if you made it this far, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.